Tonight we're going to look at Absalom. See, I found a picture of a good-looking, long-haired man to put up there, just so we could kind of get an idea. We don't really know what he looked like, but just kind of get an idea. Absalom was the third son of King David. So we need to keep that in mind as we study him tonight. So he was not directly in line to be king after David passed. So we need to remember that. Tonight we're going to study about him and the events leading up to him usurping the throne. And we'll also see how David and his people fled from Jerusalem after that. And then we'll finally see what eventually happened to Absalom. Now, the story of Absalom really starts with this story about Amnon and Tamar in 2 Samuel chapter 13. Now, Tamar was Absalom's sister. They were brother and sister, and they had the same mother. Their mother was the daughter of the king of Gershom, and we're going to see that come into play here in a minute. And and Amnon was the firstborn. He would have been in line to be king. He was their half brother, so they had the same father but different mothers. Now we see in 2 Samuel chapter 13 that Amnon loved Tamar. I don't know if it was love; it was probably more lust than anything. But we see there that he devised a scheme to get her alone in his house by pretending that he was sick. And so she came to see about him and to bring him food. And while he had her alone in his house, he forced her to lie with him. And then immediately he despised her and kicked her out of his house. So to say that he mistreated his sister is an understatement. Well, Absalom found out about this, and because of how Amnon had treated his sister, he hated Amnon. And then we see that between chapters 13 and 14, that 2 years later, Absalom planned and killed Amnon. So he actually invited his brother and other sons of the king to go with them to shear sheep in a different place outside of Jerusalem. And while there, he planned and assassinated, had Amnon killed. After that, he fled to Geshur for 3 years. Remember, I said his mother was the daughter of the king of Geshur. So basically, he went to his grandfather's place when he fled from Jerusalem. Well, he stayed in Geshur for 3 years, and Joab was instrumental in bringing Absalom back to Jerusalem. And so he brought Joab back to Jerusalem. But for 2 more years, he did not see the face of his father. And so that was basically 5 years that he went without seeing his father. And of course, I believe that has some effects, and we'll talk about that later on when we look at some of the lessons to learn. Well, David eventually forgave Absalom, and they reconciled. But I think that there was some lasting harm from that relationship that they had before their reconciliation. Well, let's talk about the man Absalom. That's who we're studying tonight, and we need to understand a little bit about the man. First, his appearance is described in 2 Samuel chapter 14, if you'll look at verses 25 and 26, it says, now in all Israel there was no one as handsome as Absalom, so highly praised. From the sole of his foot to the crown of his head, there was no defect in him. And when he cut the hair of his head, and it was at the end of every year that he cut it, for it was heavy on him, so he cut it. He weighed the hair of his head at 200 shekels by the king's weight. Now, if you have another version, it might say 6 pounds. 6 pounds of hair is what he cut off. Boy, that's a lot of hair. I don't know how much hair it takes to make 6 pounds, but that's what he cut off. We don't know how long it got, and we don't know how much he cut off and how much he left. But we know that he had long hair. So I imagine, that he probably cut off maybe half of it and still left it long for it to grow for another year. But we don't know for sure. Now, that heavy head of hair would have given him great neck strength. Just imagine that. Carrying around the weight of your head plus all of that hair would have given him some great neck strength. And that's going to be important to understand when we get toward the end of the lesson, and I'll make an application of that. I found this commentary as I was researching this. A strong growth of hair was a sign of great manly power. And I'm not going to attempt to name those, the two fellows that I found that commentary on. But I think that's important for us to understand in that day and time, and probably even even in other times, it has been a sign of great manly power, and it added to his good looks and appeal. So we see from reading the scripture there in 2 Samuel 14 that he was a very good looking man with no defect. And not only that, but I read some things, and I didn't put this in the PowerPoint, but I read some things about how his good looks and the amount of hair that he had would have even been sort of a challenge to King David. Because usually good-looking men with lots of hair would be king. And so that was probably a challenge to even King David without even having to say anything. And that's going to be important to understand as we get to some of the other points. Well, Absalom was a charismatic man. Look at 2 Samuel chapter 15. Let's read verses 1 through 6. It says, now it came about after this that Absalom provided for himself a chariot and horses and 50 men as runners before him. And Absalom used to rise early and stand beside the way to the gate. And it happened that when any man had a suit to come to the king for judgment, Absalom would call to him and say, from what city are you? And he would say, your servant is from one of the tribes of Israel. Then Absalom would say to him, see, your claims are good and right, but no man listens to you on the part of the king. Moreover, Absalom would say, oh, that one would appoint me judge in the land. Then every man who has any suit or cause could come to me, and I would give him justice. And it happened that when a man came near to prostrate himself before him, he would put out his hand and take hold of him and kiss him. And in this manner, Absalom dealt with all Israel who came to the king for judgment. So Absalom stole away the hearts of the men of Israel. Do you see what Absalom was doing here? He was a very charismatic man. He was acting like the people didn't really have a case with David, and that if he could be the judge, he would give everybody justice, and he would treat everybody fairly, and he would listen to their case. Well, we see in this reading that he was vain and conceited. Uh, he had these horses and he had 50 men to run before him. 50. That's a lot of people to run before somebody like this. They were probably the whole time proclaiming, "Here comes Absalom, the son of the king," or something like that. So he would parade around town or parade around the palace, so that everyone saw him. So we see that he was very vain and conceited, uh, and that he stole the hearts of the men of Israel. And this is something that happened over 4 years. So it's something that he seems to have planned and come into and took advantage of. Look at verse 7. It says, "Now it came about at the end of 40 years." I think that 40 is wrong. Some translations say after 4 years. I don't think it would be 40 years because King David himself reigned for 40 years. So it doesn't make sense that there would be 40 years there. So uh, the way some translations render it is 4 years, and I think that's more accurate. But it came about after the 4 years that Absalom said to the king, "Please let me go and pay my vow, which I have vowed to the Lord in Hebrew." So we see that 4 years passed while he was doing these things. He was parading around the palace. He was holding himself out as someone very important. He was speaking to the people at the gate who came to talk to the king, who came with a suit, and really stealing the hearts of the people of Israel. And just think if one person went back and told all the people around them and all their neighbors about all the things that Absalom was doing, how it would affect the whole countryside of Israel. And so he did this over a matter of 4 years. This shows how cunning and conniving he was. And so not only was he vain and conceited, but also cunning and conniving. And we'll see in just a minute that he has other things in mind, uh, rather than just being a son of the king and trying to be nice to people. He has an ulterior motive in mind. Well, and that motive is that he started a rebellion, a conspiracy. Is what it starts out as. We read in verse 7 about his excuse to leave, and he says to the king there, "Please let me go and pay my vow, which I have vowed to the Lord in Hebron." In verse 7, and verse 8 says, "For your servant vowed a vow while I was living at Gesher in Aram, saying, If the Lord shall indeed bring me back to Jerusalem, then I will serve the Lord." And the king said to him, "Go in peace." So he arose and went to Hebron. Now, I don't know if he was being honest here or if he just made this up. This is the only indication we see that he had any relationship with the Lord. It's not mentioned in any of the text about Absalom that he was religious, that he had a relationship with the Lord, that he walked in the same way that David did. We're not told that about him. I think because we're not told that he probably didn't have a good relationship with the Lord. My thinking is he made this up. He made up an excuse so he could leave Jerusalem and start a rebellion, because it would be hard to do it in Jerusalem. So he had to leave Jerusalem and go somewhere else. In verse 9, it says, "And the king said to him, Go in peace." So he arose and went to Hebron. So he went to Hebron. He didn't stay in Jerusalem. So Hebron is where he's going to start his rebellion. Well, the conspiracy gained strength and his following increased. Look at verses 10 through 12. But Absalom sent spies throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, As soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, then you shall say, Absalom is king in Hebron. Then 200 young men went with Absalom from Jerusalem, who were invited and went innocently. They did not know anything. And Absalom sent for Ahithophel, the Gilonite, David's counselor from the city of Gilo, while he was offering the sacrifices, and the conspiracy was strong, for the people increased continually with Absalom. So, one reason I think he made this excuse up, look at verse 10. What does that start with? The word but. But he pretended that he had a vow. He pretended. So he said these things to his father for an excuse. And then verse 10 says, but what? He went and started a rebellion. So I don't think he was honest with his father about that. I don't think he had a relationship with the Lord because of that but. So the conspiracy gained strength, and his following gained strength. And we see there at the end of verse 12 that the people increased continually with Absalom. So there were 200 men that went with him. They had no idea about what was going on. But the spies that he sent throughout all the 12 tribes, they knew what was going on. They were part of it. And then, of course, all he had to do was start telling Israel that he was king. And since he had already stolen away their hearts, it was only natural for them to just follow him. Well, we see in verse 13 that a messenger came and told David, the hearts of the people are with Absalom. And so David must have already heard about the conspiracy. He already heard that there was a rebellion brewing. And so this messenger comes and says, everybody's really with Israel on this. And so what does David do? Well, he decides, okay, it's time to flee Jerusalem because Absalom's going to come with people and with an army, and we need to get out of here. And so that's exactly what David did. So Absalom became king, and his adversarial role fulfilled the prophecy. And I'm going to look at that prophecy in a few minutes. So David fled Jerusalem in chapter 15. We see that he left with his entire household, all his men, and 600 Gittites. And so it was a pretty large party of people. So they left Jerusalem. They went out. Only he left 10 concubines to care for the palace. And that's important to remember. And so along the way, after they round about the time they were crossing the Jordan River or close to it, he sent Zadok and Abiathar, the priests, back to Jerusalem along with their sons in order to set up an intelligence network. And so they were to gather information and give it to their sons, and their sons were going to run with the information and relay it to David's party so that they would know what was going on in Jerusalem. Also, Hushai, who was a very trusted servant of David's, David sent back. He was a counselor, just like Ahithophel was, but Ahithophel had gone on the side with Absalom, and so he became Absalom's counselor. And so David sent Hushai back to Jerusalem also, so that he could frustrate the counsel of Ahithophel. And so we'll look at that also. Well, we see that Absalom begins reigning in Jerusalem. So Absalom and all the men of Israel came to Jerusalem with Ahithophel. And then we see that he sleeps with his father's concubines. Remember the 10 concubines that he left there? And of course, that fulfilled prophecy from Nathan. In 2 Samuel 12:11, when Nathan came to David to confront him about his sin with Bathsheba and the killing of her husband, uh, Uriah the Hittite, after that was revealed to David, and David realized that he had sinned, uh, Nathan announced some things that were going to happen to him. Of course, we know that the child that came from that relationship was to die, but also he said this: "Thus says the Lord, behold, I will raise up adversity against you from your own house, and I will take your wives before your eyes and give them to your neighbor, and he shall lie with your wives in the sight of this sun." And so here we see what I had alluded to earlier, that Absalom fulfilled prophecy by becoming king here, because he fulfilled his adversarial role as predicted by, or as prophesied by Nathan, uh, where Nathan says, "I will raise up adversity against you from your own house." So that was the first prophecy that was fulfilled. And then the other prophecy was about the wives that he would give to his neighbor. And of course, when Absalom got there, they pitched a tent on the roof, and Ahithophel uh, told the king that he should lie with the king's concubines in order to uh, in order to show his power and his disdain for the king. And so he pitched that tent on the roof and lied with his uh, his father's concubines in the sight of all of Israel. So it was certainly done in the sight of the sun, as the prophecy says. Okay, let's talk about the advisors. I've already alluded to Ahithophel, who was Absalom's advisor, and so he gave advice to Absalom in chapter 17, verses 1 through 4. It says, "Furthermore, Ahithophel said to Absalom, please let me choose 12,000 men that I may arise and pursue David tonight. And I will come upon him while he is weary and exhausted, and will terrify him so that all the people who are with him will flee. Then I will strike down the king alone, and I will bring back all the people to you. The return of everyone depends on the man you seek, and all the people shall be at peace." So the plan pleased Absalom and all the elders of Israel. So this sounded like a pretty good plan, didn't it? It sounded like good advice. You know, they're weak, they're weary, and that was true. They were. I mean, if you read the account of David and his people fleeing, they were very exhausted. They were hungry. Uh, the good thing was people came along the way and gave them supplies, but they were very exhausted and weary. And so his counsel sounded really good. But then Absalom thought, well, Hushai had come back, and he had told Absalom that he would be a counselor for him, just like he had done for his father. And so he pretended to be a counselor to help him, but he wasn't. Uh, and, and so uh, and so Absalom asked for his advice, and we're given that advice in verses 7 through 14 of chapter 17. It says, "So Hushai said to Absalom, this time the advice of Ahithophel has given is not good. Moreover, Hushai said, you know your father and his men, that they are mighty men, and they are fierce, like a bear robbed of her cubs in the field. and your father is an expert in warfare and will not spend the night with the people. And so Hushai is reminding Absalom about his father and what kind of warrior he is, and how what kind of mighty man he is, and the men that are with him, how mighty and valiant they are. He's reminding him of that. And look what he says. He says, "Behold, now he has hidden himself in one of the caves or in another place." And we know that David went in caves from time to time. Remember the encounters with King Saul. And it will be when he falls on them at the first attack that whoever hears it will say, "There has been a slaughter among the people who follow Absalom." And even the one who is valiant, whose heart is like the heart of a lion, will completely lose heart. For all Israel knows that your father is a mighty man, and those who are with him are valiant men. But I counsel that all Israel be surely gathered to you from Dan even to Beersheba, as the sand that is by the sea in abundance, and that you personally go into battle. So we shall come to him in one of the places where he can be found, and we will fall on him as the dew falls on the ground. And of him and all the men who are with him, not even one will be left. And if he withdraws into a city, then all Israel shall bring ropes to that city, and we will drag it into the valley until not even a small stone is found there. Then Absalom and all the men of Israel said, "The counsel of Hushai the Archite is better than the counsel of Ahithophel, for the Lord had ordained to thwart the good counsel of Ahithophel in order that the Lord might bring calamity on Absalom." You see what happened there? Hushai gave him some advice, and it sounded good. It sounded better than Ahithophel's advice. First of all, he reminded his son, he reminded Absalom that his father was a mighty warrior, and that his men were too, and that they would fight valiantly. And he also uh, said that, you should gather all Israel together. Don't just go into battle with 12,000 men like Ahithophel suggested. Get all of Israel together, hundreds of thousands of people, and go after him. They will not be able to resist it. And so this counsel sounded better. And so they, of course, went with Hushai's advice. So what did that do? That gave David and his men time to rest. It gave them time to prepare for the battle. And that's exactly what they did. So Absalom went with the advice of Hushai. So when Ahithophel saw that his advice was not followed, he went out, he went back home, he got everything in order, and then he hanged himself. That was a prideful man, wasn't it? To think that your advice is so good that, okay, now it's done, and I'll just hang myself since you're not going to listen to me. I don't know. I don't know what somebody is thinking when they do something like that. Okay, let's talk about the battle in chapter 18 of 2 Samuel. So David had time because they followed Hushai's advice. They had time to devise a plan. He mustered his men to fight and divided them into 3 companies. This is what a mighty warrior does. They prepare for battle. And so they were prepared. He knew from the intelligence that he was getting back from the people that he had sent back, from the priests and their sons, that they were going to be attacked. So he appointed Joab and Joab's brother Abishai and Ittai the Gittite over each company. So there were 3 companies and 3 commanders over those companies. Okay, so let's look at the fight in verse 6 of chapter 18, verses 6 through 8. Then the people went out into the field against Israel, and the battle took place in the forest of Ephraim. And the people of Israel were defeated there before the servants of David, and the slaughter there was that day was great, 20,000 men. For the battle uh, there was spread over the whole countryside, and the forest devoured more people that day than the sword devoured. And so I think we see here that the Lord was also on David's side. Now think about it, all of Israel, we don't know how many, but just think hundreds of thousands of fighters going up against David. We know he has 600 Gittites. I don't know how many of his men he had at this time, 100 or 200 maybe. So maybe 700 or 800 fighting men that were able to fight for David, going up against this huge army. God was on David's side because God was determined to bring an end to Absalom's reign and his terror. Uh, so we we also see that after that defeat, that Absalom was caught. Look at verse 9. Now Absalom happened to meet the servants of David, for Absalom was riding on his mule, and the mule went under the thick branches of a great oak, and his head caught fast in the oak. So he was left hanging between heaven and earth, while the mule uh, that was under him kept going. So, imagine this. And I looked on the internet, and there's all kinds of pictures and drawings that people have rendered. Uh, and, after I started studying this, I was surprised, because I always thought that the scripture said he was hanging by his hair, but it doesn't say that. I mean, we can imply that, but it says that his head was caught. Now, with him having all that hair, that had to have been what got caught in the thick branches of the oak tree. Now, remember earlier I said something about him having great neck strength? I want you to think about a man riding an animal. We don't know how fast he was going, but someone who didn't have great neck strength, if they were suddenly just caught by the branches of an oak, moving to just suddenly stationary, and the animal kept going, it could have broken the neck of someone with a weak neck. But Absalom had a strong neck because of the weight of his hair, so it didn't break his neck. He was just hanging there, still alive. And of course, someone saw him and reported it to Joab. And Joab said, "And you didn't strike him down?" Now, David had given instructions to his men to be merciful with his son, Absalom. He didn't want him killed. And so the man that Joab was speaking to reminded Joab of that, but Joab didn't care. Look in verses 14 and 15, what happens. Then Joab said, "I will not waste time here with you." So he took 3 spears in his hand and thrust them through the heart of Absalom while he was still yet alive in the midst of the oak. And 10 young men who carried uh, Joab's armor gathered around and struck Absalom and killed him. And so that was the end of Absalom. That was the end of his rebellion. And so we see what happened to him. And of course, after that, David mourned for his son because he loved him so much. He mourned for him, and that could be another story or invitation or something probably in the future. But anyway, that was the end of Absalom. So I want us to look now at some lessons that we can learn from this story. First of all, lying is a sin. And we talked about Absalom being deceitful and lying about his intentions with his father of going and paying his vow. Whether he did that or not, his intentions were certainly different. He had another motive, which was to take over his father's kingdom. And by a rebellion. Uh, so we also see Hushai. I think he also lied through his deceitful actions, pretending that he was a friend of Absalom when he wasn't. Uh, that's certainly deceitful. We're told there that in verse 14 of First Samuel 14 of First Samuel 17, uh, that the Lord had determined to frustrate the advice of Ahithophel to bring disaster upon Absalom. And I struggle with some of these things that we see in the scriptures where lying or something wrong was done in order to bring about a good outcome, uh, a good outcome that the Lord is pleased with. But remember, the Lord can certainly use evil that others do. He certainly can use a lie to accomplish His purpose if someone chooses to do so. I struggle with some of these stories in the Old Testament, but we know that lying is sinful. We certainly know. In Revelations, we're told that those liars, along with a whole another big list of people, that they will be cast into the lake of fire. And so that is what happens when someone lies and they don't repent of it. They will be cast into the lake of fire. So we know that that's wrong. We know that it's a sin. The second lesson that we can learn is that those who are against God cannot prevail, or against God's children, rather. We're told in Romans chapter 8:31, what then shall we say to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? No one can be against us if God is for us. If we're doing the will of God and He is on our side, uh, no one can really prevail against us. God will take care of His children. Now, He will allow us to be persecuted. He's even, in fact, allowed some Christians to die. We read about some in the New Testament, but He has allowed Christians to die. So it. But remember, the battle's not over in this life. We have another life after this one, and so God is going to take care of us. And if we don't prevail in this life, we will certainly prevail in the next life, because no one can take away our salvation. Once God gives us our salvation, no one can take it away from us. Now, we can lose it. We can certainly lose it ourselves, but no one can take it from us. Okay, the third lesson that I think we can learn is that youth is a wonderful time, but it also comes with responsibilities. Throughout this story, Absalom is referred to as a young man. We don't know what his age was, but he was referred to as a young man. And it seems that he never really took responsibility. We don't see him acting in a kingly way to help his father with the kingdom, to help Israel in a good way. He acted like he cared about the people who came to get a judgment, but he had an ulterior motive in that, which led to conspiracy and rebellion. Um, in Ecclesiastes 12:1, it says, "Remember now your Creator in the days of your youth, before the difficult days come and the years draw near, when you say, I have no pleasure in them." I made the statement earlier that I didn't think that Absalom had a relationship with the Lord, and I believe that based on the way he acted. And if he had taken his responsibilities, uh, more seriously, I mean, even after he killed his brother and came back, he could have made things right so that he could have helped his father run the kingdom. He could have been a good son. He could have been uh, a, a good man as far as his relationship with the Lord, but we're not told that he had anything like that. that he helped his father in any way. And in fact, he was rebellious instead. The fourth lesson that we can learn is that fathers should show love to their children. Uh, we see that David loved Absalom, but really never really showed it. He never really showed his love to Absalom that we can see. And whenever Absalom did something wrong, David didn't correct him. He just let it be. So when his own daughter was raped, he didn't do anything about that with the other son. And instead, David banished Absalom for 3 years, and then would not see him for another 2 years after that. So 5 years going without. And this seemed to damage their relationship and possibly push Absalom in the wrong direction. So instead of David being the kind of father that disciplined his son and guided him in the right way, he just kind of let him go and do whatever he wanted to do. And the result there was not good. So those of us who are fathers, we should learn to love our children, to make sure and discipline them and guide them in the way that they should go. And we're told that if we do that, that they will not stray far from it. Of course, that's a generality from the Proverbs, of course. So those are the lessons I think that we can learn from Absalom. So as we conclude, Absalom's life can be summed up with one word: rebellion. We see it all through the scriptures talking about him, the several chapters that we have. He was just a rebellious man. And perhaps if David had been a better father, Absalom's life would have gone in a better direction. So let's learn these lessons and not repeat what happened in this story. Let's be what God wants us to be. Let's have a relationship with him and do the things that are right in his sight. So the invitation is available for you if you have a need. If there's anything we can do for you, come while we stand and sing.